Are listening, watching from the field of English literature, language and grammar. I, Dr. Rakesh from USA, heartily, cordially welcome all of you. Dear friends, early in the morning time, we have studied Romanticism, the age of Wordsworth from 1798 to 1832, the older poets, the age of Wordsworth. The age of Wordsworth is the age of the revolution in the history of politics and of what is broadly called the romantic triumph in that of literature. Though when we speak in this way, we have to remember that the triumph of Romanticism was accompanied by that of naturalism. Now, it is most important for us to understand that the movement in literature was only one aspect of a comprehensive general movement, another aspect of which is to be found in the revolution. At bottom, both the political and the literary movements were inspired by the same impatience of formulas. Traditions, conventions, and the tyranny of the dead hand by the same insistence upon individuality and by the same craving for freedom and the larger life. In the doctrines of the new poetry, as in the teachings of the revolutionary theories, there was indeed much that assumed the shape of challenge and attack. The long accepted rules of art, in fact, prescribed rules of any kind, were treated with open contempt. The reaction against Pope and the Augustine school became aggressive, and the principle of spontaneity was everywhere, thrust to the front here and there. It is true, conservative critics endeavored to make a stand against these, to them, wild and generous, wild and dangerous ideas, as when Lord Jeffrey wrote in an early number of the Edinburgh Review, poetry has this much in common with religion, that its standards were fixed long ago by certain inspired writers, whose authority it is no longer lawful to call in question. But such a conception of things did not represent the dominant spirit of the age. The spirit was rather expressed by Keats when he wrote, "The genius of poetry must work its own salvation in a man. It cannot be measured by law and precept, but by sensation and watchfulness in itself. That which is creative must create itself." A comparison of this passage with the couplet from Pope, which we have already quoted: "Those rules of old discovered, not devised, are nature still, but nature methodist," will suffice to show the fundamental the literary movements necessarily met in the same persons, or that a person could not be an adherent of the one without sympathizing with the other. The error of such a supposition, particular form of Romanticism, was indeed, as we shall see, a part of his tourism. We are speaking only of moments, and the vital connection between these is denoted by the fact that the keynote of both was emancipation. We have, however, to go further than this and to consider the intimate association of English poetry with the various stages of the French Revolution and with the striking changes in the temper of European society which these produced. The great outburst of 1789 sent a thrill of fresh life through the whole civilized world. It came as the prophecy of a new day, and for the moment it seemed as if, leaving behind it all the evils of the past, humanity at large was to pass forward immediately into an era of realized democratic ideals of liberty, brotherhood, and the rights of man. A wonderful humanitarian enthusiasm and gorgeous dreams of progress and perfection were thus kindled in ardent young souls. And in England, quite as much as in France itself, men of generous natures were ready to catch fire by contact with passions which the French cause aroused, because as our later 18th century literature shows, there had been in England a steady growth of many of the principles which the political revolution now promised to translate out of abstractions into living facts, as Wordsworth afterwards wrote. But Europe at that time was thrilled with joy. France standing on the top of golden arch, and human nature seeming born again, and once more bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. But as the progresses of 89 were destined to remain unfulfilled, the excesses of the reign of terror, the sensational rise of Napoleon, the establishment of a military despotism, the long strain of the Napoleonic Wars, the restoration of the Bourbons, the determined attempt made by the crowned heads of Europe after Waterloo to destroy democracy and popular government, all these things were naturally productive of vast disturbances in thought and feeling. Reaction set in, the principles of revolution were discredited, and the failure of the great effort which France had made to initiate a new and better order of things resulted in a general collapse of faith and hope. The age of buoyancy and expectancy passed away. The age of unrest and disillusion succeed. Thus, we may expect to find an enormous difference in tone between the poetry of the earlier and that of the later revolutionary period. Wordsworth's life. William Wordsworth was born in 1770 at Cockermouth, Cumberland, and spent much of his boyhood among the shepherds and dalesmen of his native county. The influence of these early surroundings was, as he afterward said, profound and lasting, for rough and rugged as they were, these simple peasant folk were types of the homely virtues of manhood and womanhood, untainted by contact with the corruptions of civilization, and from his familiar intercourse with them, he learned faith in humanity and reverence for the elemental things of life. He was educated at Hogshead School, Lancashire, and at Cambridge, then came to visit to France 1790 and 1791 to 92. In 1793, he published an evening walk and descriptive sketches, in which the regular classic couplet is used and which are otherwise curiously reminiscent of Pope, Goldsmith, and Gray. A small legacy left by a friend made him so far independent that he was able henceforth to devote himself entirely to poetry or poetry. His friendship with Coleridge, which began about 1796, did much to stimulate his genius. 2 years later, Coleridge joined him in the publication of that epoch-making little book, The Lyrical Ballads. In 1802, he married Mary Hutchinson and with his devoted sister Dorothy as a third member of his household, settled first at Grasmere and later at Riddle Mount, both in that Lake district with which his name is now always associated. Though he continued to write steadily, he failed for many years to catch the public ear, while the critics almost unanimously treated him with contempt. But little by little he won his way, and readers of the new generation began to perceive greatness and meaning in his poetry to which their fathers had been blind. The general change of opinion regarding him was shown in 1843 when, on Southey's death, he was made poet laureate. He died in 1850. Some knowledge of his relations with the revolutionary movements is an indispensable preliminary to the study of his work. These relations are described in detail, together with formative influences of his life, in his autobiographical poem, The Prelude. On his first visit to France during his vacation tour in 1790, he was delighted to find benevolence and blessedness spread like a fragrance everywhere. But though his attitude towards the popular cause was sympathetic, he was for the time being only an onlooker. During the 13 months of his second visit, his position was very different. At Orleans, where the greater part of his time was spent, he formed an intimacy with an officer of Girondist views named Beaupois, with whom he freely discussed the inequities of the old order and speculated on all the golden promises of the new, and he how became such an enthusiastic supporter of the revolution that on his arrival in Paris in October 1792, just after the September massacre, he was on the point of throwing in his lot with the Girondist party. Fortunately for him, he received a peremptory call from relatives in England and returned in time to escape the disaster which overwhelmed that party in the region of terror. In England, he found conservative opinion running strongly against the revolution, the defense of which he accordingly undertook in an open letter to the Bishop of Llandaff. The outbreak of war between France and England, however, precipitated a crisis in his thought. At first he held fast to the French cause, then came the terror and his faith was rudely shaken. It revived for a moment on the fall of Robespierre, only to be destroyed forever by the rise of Napoleon and the events which followed. Then reaction set in, and this reaction led him first to rupture with France, then to the repudiation of the abstract principles behind the revolution, and finally to the complete recantation of all his youthful progressive ideas. Thus, Wordsworth, who began as an adherent of the revolution, ended as an extreme conservative. Even during his residence in France, he had deplored the fact that the cause of progress entailed the destruction, together with the evils of the past, of so much that was sacred through age and association. The sense of the sanctity of the past now became a prominent element in his thought and made him an earnest supporter of English institutions and traditions. Yet, despite the apparently complete collapse of all his revolutionary ideals, Wordsworth's work remained to the end a part of the great general democratic movement of the time. We shall understand this on turning to his theory of poetry, the lyrical ballads, and Wordsworth's theory of poetry. I have spoken of the lyrical ballads as an epoch making little book, and it is universally admitted that a new chapter in the history of English poetry opens with its publication. The explanation of this is to be found in the fact that it marks the full development of both Romanticism and Naturalism. As Coleridge afterwards explained, the design of the collaborators was to include in it two different kinds of poetry. In the one, the incidents and agents were to be, in part at least, supernatural. In the other, subjects were to be chosen from ordinary life. Romanticism was represented by Coleridge's single contribution, the Ancient Mariner; Naturalism by Wordsworth's Goody Black, The Thorn, The Idiot Boy, and other similar productions. In his preface to the second edition of the Ballads, Wordsworth further sets forth his aims. The principal object then proposed in these poems was to choose incidents and situations from common life and then to relate or describe them throughout in a selection of the language really used by man, and at the same time to throw over them a certain coloring of imagination whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect. And he goes on to say that humble and rustic life was generally chosen because in that condition the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity, are less under restraint, and speak a plainer and more emphatic language. In this declaration, 3 points call for comment. In the first place, there is Wordsworth's choice of subject. In search of themes, he goes straight to common life and by preference for the reasons assigned to humble rustic life. This was throughout his habit in his narrative and descriptive poems, of which maybe Michael may be mentioned as a typical example. Secondly, in the treatment of such themes, he sets out to employ the appropriate language of actual life in place of the pompous and styled circumlocutions of 18th century writers. This brings us to his famous attack upon the whole practice of the Augustan school and its giddiness, and in an phraseology to this attack we have more than once had occasion to allude. In connection with it, it should here be noted that in seeking to obliterate the difference between the language of poetry and that of good prose, Wordsworth pushed his theories much too far that, save in his early experiments, he did not himself adhere to his own principles, and that none the less his arguments were of immense service in helping to destroy the practice of the long accepted hackneyed and conventional diction, and so substitute a simple and natural style in poetry. Thirdly, Wordsworth specially guards himself against the accusation of absolute realism by emphasizing his use of imagination in the poetic transformation of his materials. This is a protest against the hard, literal, unimaginative treatment of life to which naturalism had led, as in the case of Crabbe. It will now be seen why we are justified in describing Wordsworth's work as part of the general democratic movement of his time. His comprehensive sympathies, his insistence upon the primary and essential qualities of human nature, as distinguished from the merely external and factitious, his firm belief in natural manhood, his deliberate selection of all these features him with the radical tendencies of the revolutionary age. The whole trend of his writings was, moreover, towards the simplification of life, and in this way again he was in harmony with the revolutionary spirit. Even his theory of poetic diction is only another aspect of his general effort to pierce down through artifice and convention to nature and reality. Dear friends, next year land of artificial life. So, Wordsworth is our greatest poet of the country and of natural life. As an interpreter of nature, he still holds the first place unchallenged. His love of nature was boundless, and his knowledge of nature was equal to his love. He wrote always with his eye steadily fixed upon his objects. Nothing was too small to escape his attention, and his controlling purpose was to render with absolute fidelity what he had seen. He has been called of all modern poets for what is deep and essential in nature, and it has justly been said that in all his descriptions every touch is true, not the copying of a literary phrase, but the result of direct observation. Yet love, knowledge, and fidelity are not, after all, the most specific and personal qualities in Wordsworth's nature poetry, but rather the profound religious feeling which pervades it, as he shows us again and again in many of his poems in the lines written above Tintern Abbey, for example, and the ode on the intimations of immortality, when he insists that nature is the greatest of all teachers. He means that between the indwelling soul of the universe and the soul of man, which is akin to it, spiritual communion is possible, through which we may gain constantly in power, peace, and happiness. While, however, Wordsworth is essentially the poet of nature, he is not the less the poet of man, and in what he writes about human life, his greatness as a moralist is especially apparent. His greatness results largely from his firm hold upon the central facts of conduct and duty, and his abiding sense of the supremacy of the moral law. His emphasis is everywhere thrown upon those spiritual forces within us which give us power over ourselves and the ability, if we exercise them aright, are very obvious. He had no humor and little passion and was singularly deficient in dramatic power. Even those who revere him most are bound to acknowledge that he wrote more uninspired and unpoetic verse than any other poet of equal rank. In his stately in his statedly philosophical poetry, particularly and notably in the excursion, he often indulges for hundreds of lines together in prolix moralizings of the dullest and the most prosaic collected works and beyond most great poets. Therefore, he gains by judicious selection. But if what is best and really vital in its voluminous output is relativity to the total bulk of its small in amount. It comprises some of the finest treasures in English poetry and suffices to give him a high place among those of whom he himself writes. Blessings be with them and eternal praise, who gave us nobler loves and nobler cares. The poets who on earth have made us hearers of truth and pure delight by heaven lage. Coleridge. Wordsworth's friend Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1772 to 1834, was a boy and instantly appealed to him, and he welcomed it in some youthful verses. He carried his enthusiasm with him to Cambridge, where, however, he suffered much ill health and anxiety about debts. In 1794, he met Robert Southey, afterwards his brother-in-law, and Coleridge christened Pantocracy for the establishment of an ideal society on the banks of the Susquehanna River in America. This utopian plan, a direct product of expression to his political aspirations in religious musings, the destiny of nations, and ode to the departing years, soon came it shone in his Candide France, an ode 1798, which he himself called his recantation, a story of aimless wanderings, of plains made and abandoned, of failure and the and slavery to opium, which lasted many years, helped still further to paralyze, but the dreams were never realized and the books were never written. All his work is he exercised an influence out of all proportion to the bulk and apparent importance of his writings. What is best in Coleridge's poetry is very small in amount, but that little is whole have a pathetic interest in connection with the tragedy of ineffectiveness which made up so much of his life. As free as Wordsworth's native poems represent this particular province, and far beyond any writer before him, he treated the supernatural in a purely poetic way. It will be remembered that Wordsworth saved naturalism from the hardly saved supernaturalism from the coarse sensationalism then in vogue by linking what far more popular and influential descendant of families whose names have figured prominently in the annals of Scottish chivalry, Scott was born in Edinburgh in 1771 and spent much of his childhood at grandfather's home at Sandy Knowe in the border country where he learned to love the wild, rough landscape and where his boyish imagination was stirred by the stories which his own had taken part and of later Jacobite risings in support of Prince Charlie. A chance reading he was certain of Percy's relic. From that time on, one of his favorite volumes aroused a passionate interest in ancient ballads, which he soon began to collect on his own account. While reading for the bar and during his early practice, he made several long vacation excursions into the Highlands, the inspiring purpose of which was always romantic and antiquarian. And as to go into the Highlands in those days meant to step right out of the present into the feudal past. He gathered rich stores of material for future use. A born Tory whose sympathies were entirely with the feudal and chivalrous order, he was little affected by the revolution, which, save that it served to deepen his hatred of democracy and to throw him back with fresh ardor upon history and romance, was only an incident in his career. But meanwhile, he had become interested in German Romantic literature, and the translating of some German ballads led him to independent experiments of the same kind. In these, he was encouraged by Lavish, then still inspired by Percy. He turned his large collections of many years to good account in his first important publication, the minstrelsy of the Scottish The Last Minstrel 1805, a short of extended ballad full of border incidents, poetic real story, and this scored a success which surprised no one more than Scott himself. It was followed by other romances in verse, of which the most important are Mary Moyne 1808, The Lady of the Lake 1810, and Roke by 1813. Then the gradual enthusiasm of the vein opened up by the lay and the dangerous rivalry of Byron, who just then took the British public by storm, compelled Scott to seek a fresh outlet for his genius, and with the provision of Waverley, a romantic novelist, of his work in prose fiction, I shall speak in another chapter. Here I may add, financial ruin overtook him in 1825, that unspoilt by long good fortune, he now showed himself heroic in adversity, that despite fast falling health, he kept up to the last his splendid struggle to wipe off his immense indebted altogether the classic epic as his model and his romantic tales in verse, as he called, represent a natural development of the old ballad and medieval romance and commonplace. He can tell a story admirably and is particularly successful with scenes of stirring action and above all with his battle pieces. In the last, he was nothing of the mystical quality, spiritual power of Wordsworth and Coleridge. He rarely takes us beneath the surface of things. He carries no weight of thought, and while his tone is eminently healthy, his with Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Scott, I will here associate the more important poets who were born in their decade or earlier, that is before 1780. Taken in their chronological order, they are as follow: William Leslie Bowles (1762 to 1850), Robert Southey Samuel Roser (1763 to 1855), James Hogg (1770 to 1835), Robert Southey (1774 to 1843), Walter Savage Landor (1775 to 1864), Thomas Campbell (1777 to 1844), and Thomas More (1779 to 1852). Though little known today, Bowley describes a word of kindly recognition because his sonnets, written chiefly in picturesque spots during a journey, helped the growth of a love of nature in poetry in the years immediately preceding the lyrical ballads. Coleridge testified to the great influence they had upon him when he read them as a youth, and they were much admired also by Wordsworth. Rogers, who was a successful banker as well as a poet, a rare combination, lived well on into the Victorian age, yet remained practically untouched by the spirit of the revolution and by the new movements in literature, of which he witnessed the rise and triumph. His Pleasures of Memory 1792 is written in the orthodox closed couplet and in the correct Augustan style, and through his guidebook poem Italy 1822 is in blank verse. It maintains the tradition of artificial elegance. Rogers belonged to the past but did not possess the strength of genius to initiate a reaction. Hogg, nicknamed the Eric Shepherd, is better known today, though his friendship with some of Edinburgh's famous literary men, including Scott, then for his own work, though he wrote much in prose and verse. Some of his ballads keep an honorable place in Scottish vernacular literature, while his love poems Kilmeny and the Queen Wake have a certain amount of fancy and power. After Burns, though a long way after, he is the truest poet who has ever sprung direct from the Scottish peasantry. Southey deserves a somewhat fuller notice. Like Wordsworth and Coleridge, he fell as a youth under the spell of the Revolution and gave vent to the most violent radical ideas and to his impatience of things that are done under the sun in an epic. John of Arc, written 1793, published 1796, a drama, Wat Tyler, 1794, and a number of minor poems. The overthrow of the Girondist party was the turning point in his political history, and ultimately, like Wordsworth and Coleridge, he repudiated all his early ideas and became a Tory of the Tories. He was a man of prodigious industry in verse and prose. His poems alone, filling a volume of 800 pages of fine print in double columns. Little of this enormous output, however, now really lives except some of his ballads, which are excellent, and such delightful lyrics as After Blenheim, The Holy Tree, and The Scholar. His, his Fawn of Arc and Wat Tyler are full of all the extravagances which we should expect in the work of a raw, high spirited youth, his ill advised and ludicrous eulogy of George III, a vision of judgment, is remembered only through Byron's scathing satire upon it. His immense narrative poems, on which he staked his poetic reputation, Madoc, Thalabe, Adestoe, Frederick, the curse of Kahama, though greatly admired at the time by men like Scott, Pender, must now be regarded as monuments rather of their authors' learning and industry than of real poetic inspiration. Yet their historical importance is considerable. They show the tendency of the Romantic movement to carry the poet further and further afield in quest of fresh, striking, and picturesque subjects, and two of them mark an extreme reaction in form against the regularity of 18th century versification. Thalaba is in unrhymed verses of varying length and metrical structures. Lander wrote poetry all through his long life, his first volume appearing in 1795, his last in 1863. But while he gained an audience fit though few, he never became popular. He may be described as a classic writing in a romantic age, but his classicism was of the genius Greek kind and had nothing in common with the pseudo classicism of the 18th century. Whether he deals with classic themes as in his Hellenics or with romantic as in Jabri, he writes in the same restrained, severe, and sculpturesque manner as Sir Henry Taylor said of him. He lived in a past world of heroic thought, unaltered by the events of common life. He passed nearly through the most eventful century of the world without learning from experience and almost without adding to his ideas. Dear friends, next year listening continue the Romantic Age, the age of Wordsworth, the younger poets, the later revolutionary age. The close of the French Revolution did not mean the end of the revolutionary movement, even in the field of politics. The peoples of Europe had been aroused and were not now to be crushed or pacified. Hence, repeated disturbances in Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and much dangerous discontent in England. But meanwhile, as we have seen, a strong conservative reaction had set in. Many of the older generation abandoned their early faith, and for a time the principles of progress and the old enthusiasm and hope had gone, and their collapse was followed here by apathy and indifference. Thereby, the cynicism which often results from exploded idealism, and there again by the mood of bitter disappointment and aimless unrest. Such were the conditions which naturally weighted heavily upon the English poets who were born into the later revolutionary age. Yet every man will respond to the influences of his time in accordance with the peculiarities of his own genius and character. And though the three chief poets of our younger revolutionary group, Byron, Shelley, and Keats, breathed the same atmosphere, and saw the same forces at work about them. Nothing could well be more striking than the contrast between each in the quality and temper of their poetry. Byron, the eldest of the three, thoroughly representative because more than any other English writer, he expressed that spirit of rebellion at once comprehensive, passionate, and impotent, which was one of the salient features of his age. His own temperament and stormy life helped to become its mouthpiece. Born in 1788, he sprang from a wild, unruly stock and fire which repeatedly brought him into conflict with men and things. Hardly more than a boy, he published a little attack. He replied in a vigorous satire, English bards, cantos of child Harold's pilgrimage, in which descriptions of the places variation upon the instinct of grandeur and power. Published in 1812, these two cantos scored an immense success. I woke up one morning, said dictated his of read the bride of Abydos, the siege of Corinth, the Corsair. In 1815, he married. A year after, he a year after and denied monster of iniquity by the England an embittered man. The remainder of his life was spent on the continent, and it was during these years of exile that he produced his greatest work, Manfred, Can, the third and the fourth canto of Child and the unfinished Don Juan. In the end, weary of fame, of poetry, even of he threw himself into the cause of Greece, then struggling for freedom against the Turks, took the field and died in 1824 of a fever at Missolonghi before he had completed his 37th year. Byron wrote with almost incredible facility, and his work is not only very voluminous but also including as it does lyrics, satires, narrative poems, serious and serio-comic, regular plays and dramatic poems, apparently very varied. But the variety is only apparent. For Byron was a supreme egotist, and no matter what the form adopted, readily travelled out sunny as critic theorist. He proclaimed himself an authority of the 18th century with a Greek temple and that of his own time with a barbarous Turkish. Yet, as he himself had, for whatever his feeling and of taste have played havoc with his poetry, dear friends, his plays literature, which we still stick of his writing as a revolutionary poet, he had no faith in the older order, and in many places our great entrepreneur of revolution, our revolutionary idealist and poetic prophet of faith and word, with the movement lost the war. He was the son of a Tory squire, was where however he was soon expelled for publishing a pamphlet lecture on his family, and found himself after the tragic death of his young wife. He married Mary and proved a very happy one. For a Mary he had an intellectual companion and a comfort and stay amid all the troubles arising from quarrels with his relatives, lawsuits about his property and his children, and his own highly strung temperament and fragile health. In 1888, he left England for Italy and in 1822 was drowned while sailing across the Bay of Spezia. In the body of Shelley's writings, two poems. One is Adonish, a splendid elegy on the death of Keats. The other, the Sensi, a romantic dream, a romantic drama on a subject really too horrible for treatment, which nonetheless rises in places to the height of tragic intensity, which we can parallel only by going back to some of the greatest things of the Elizabethan stage. Apart from these, his poems fall into two divisions. There are, in the first place, his personal poems. Shelley's genius was essentially lyrical, and his moods with our very greatest, and no praise would be excessive for the ecstasy of feeling, the light grace, the felicity of phrases, and the verbal magic of such poems. For example, as the skylark, the cloud, the sunbonnet, the ode to the and the lament. In the second place, there are the impersonal poems. Dreamer of dreams, as he was, Shelley yet conceived it to be part of his poetic mission to become the inspirer and guide of man. He had, as he confessed, a passion for reforming the world, and this passion blazes out again and again in his poetry in flames that are now fiercely lurid and now matchlessly pure. As he explained in the preface to the revolt of Islam, he believed that the reaction which had followed the revolution, though inevitable with those who did not look beneath the surface of things, would prove to be a temporary reaction only. Already he thought the gloom and misanthropy which it had bred were passing away, and thus, despite the surrounding darkness of his such was the faith by which his humanitarian poems were inspired. In Queen Mab, which he wrote at 18th, his revolutionary creed had not yet passed beyond the destructive stage. Based on Godwin's political justice, all passages of which are simply turned into verse, this violent and aggressive poem proclaims an individualistic philosophy of the most uncompromising kind. All institutions are condemned: kings and governments, church, property, and marriage, while Christianity falls under the same sweeping censor. Yet, even this extravagant diatribe is redeemed by that fine passion for humanity which formed the basis of Shelley's religion, the revolt of Islam, which followed in 1817. Is a long rambling narrative in Spencerian story. It is confused and all unintelligible, but it is very important as helping us to understand the fundamental difference between Shelley and Byron, as told one, the rest of them are gross egotists, and as I have said, here rebels against society. Lyon, the hero of the revolt of Islam, on the other hand, is filled with Shelley's own magnificent and unselfish enthusiasm. His one abiding purpose is to be the savior of society. Is in the end, he becomes a willing martyr for the cause of man. But the fullest and finest expression of Shelley's faith and hope is to be found in his superb lyrical myth. The Titan stands forth as the prototype of mankind in its long struggle against the forces of despotism, symbolized by Jupiter, and the allegory closes with a magnificent choral outburst over the consummation of the divine purpose in a regenerated world. John Keats, in John Keats 1795 to 1821, the last and the youngest of the later revolutionary group, we have a remarkable contrast both with Byron on the one side and with Shelley on the other. Keats was neither rebel nor utopian dreamer, endowed with a purely artistic nature. He took up in regard to all the movements and conflicts of his time a position of almost complete detachment. He knew nothing of Byron's stormy spirit of antagonism to the existing order of things, and he had no sympathy with Shelley's humanitarian zeal and passion for reforming the world. According to his conception of it, poetry should be not the vehicle of philosophy, incarnation of beauty. The famous opening lines of Endymion, a thing of beauty is a joy forever, strikes the core, the principles of beauty in all things, and as the modern world seemed to him to be hard, cold, and prosaic, he habitually sought an imaginative escape from it, not like Shelley into the future land of promise, but into the past of Greek mythology, as in Endymion, Lamia, and the fragmentary Hypernian, or of medieval romance, as in the Eve of Saint Agnes, Isabella, and La Belle Dame Sans Mercy. In his treatment of nature, this same passion for sensuous beauty is still the dominant feature. He loved nature just for its own sake and for the glory and loveliness, of which he everywhere nothing mystical in the love of nature was. Keats died of consumption before he had completed his 26th year, and is therefore, in Shelley's phrase, one of the inheritors of unfulfilled renown. Allowance must thus always be made for the immaturity and experimental character of much of his work. His genius was ripening steadily at the time of his premature death, and we can measure his moral and spiritual as well as his artistic growth during the few years of his manhood by comparing his first little volume of verse published in 1817, or Endymion, which appeared the next year, with the contents of his third and last volume, the volume of 1819, and especially with the great odes to autumn, to a nightingale, and on a Grecian urn. But even as it is, his place is assured, as Shelley prophesied with the enduring dead. Historically, he is important for three reasons. First, on the side of the form and style, he is the most romantic of the romantic poets, handling even his Greek themes with a luxuriance of language and a wealth of detail as far as possible removed from the temperance and restraint of Hellenic art. Here, in particular, we note his entire rejection of the classic couplet, for which, following the lead of his friend Leigh Hunt, he substituted couplets of the loose romantic type. Secondly, more than any other great poet of his time, he represents the evolution of the revolution. For him, poetry breaks away from the interest of contemporary life of the past and devotes itself to the service of beauty. It is for this reason that he seems to stand definitely at the ends of the later Reich, which was a period of great poetic activity, to 1859. Because of his close relation to Shelley, it was his story of Rimini, 1816, that the classic couplet was first rejected in favor of, as we have seen, but also by Shelley, though it should be degree of Lovelace, Thoms, or Tom Hood, 1799 to 1845 is remotely connected with Keats, for he married a sister of Keats' mother, protracted struggle against poverty and death of the war at Love must be set aside as valueless, but his serious poetry should not be neglected, for he was a dream of using Aram, the song of the shirt, the bridge of sighs, fair Inez. I remember his ode to melancholy and his sonnet silence are among us the finest things of the end in the language. The plea for the midsummer night fairies in full of grey fancy haunted has is roared with a splendidly sustained imaginary voice. Wordsworth were right. Richer and poorer his life, he was the last of his zenith. Peasant overlords to come our lifetime are represented in selected poems. A Time editor has collected poems of players mentioned in the History of Prose established in 1802 by G. Brougham, Sidney Smith and other prominent men of letters of the party. 7 years later, first editor, and on his retirement in 1824, he was succeeded by Scott's son, as the name implied, were in the magazine. Editorially launched in 1813, Wilson broke Hart and Hogg, and shortly after his death, therefore, to realize the influence which this form to as writing. For this reason, we find that most of the prose writers of the time were essayists rather than makers of books. Secondly, it of this literature of criticism, considerable space was naturally devoted to the discussion of the respective principles and merits. It should also be noted that fundamental changes now appear in the form and tempo of prose, and that these changes are parallel with those which had come over verse. We have seen how modern prose arose at the time of Restoration, and with what effect it was employed in the 18th century was masters like Addison and Goldsmith. Yet this prose was a characteristic product of its age in its limitations as well as in its excellencies. It had lucidly It had lucidity, grace, and charm, but it was wanting in variety. One could express strong passion, deep feeling, and color. We shall not be surprised, therefore, to learn that many of the prose writers of the early 19th century discarded entirely the 18th century tradition and sought richer harmonies and greater complexity of structure. This new movement in prose, like the corresponding movement in verse, was in part connected with the revival of interest in our pre-Augustan authors in three groups, taking first those who were chiefly associated with the two great Edinburgh periodicals, secondly the London men who were largely, if not entirely, journalists and miscellanists, and the lastly such Edinburgh man Francis 1773 to 1850, called by his admirers Edinburgh, may be regarded as the most influential, though not the greatest critic of his time. On the whole, as our quotation in 86 will have shown, the represents the conservative side in criticism. He was not indeed consistently opposed to the Romantic movement, nor was he a blind supporter of the Augustan tradition, but his general influence was on the side of authority and against innovation. Today, his criticism seems in general unsatisfactory. He lacked breadth, he lacked breadth of sympathy and flexibility of judgment. His object was not to interpret but to arraign and, if possible, to condemn. He was often brutal. He cared little for subject matter and fixed his attention on form and style, and he had no feeling for the large human aspects of literature. His chief coadjutor, Sidney Smith, 1771 to 1845, was an exceedingly clever clergyman who is now better known for his witticism than for his literature. He contributed some 65 articles to the Edinburgh and produced a considerable body of the other work, including a brilliant satire on the Irish question. For this reason, they are now little read, which is a pity, for they are full of things. Dear friends, your presence is praiseworthy. Remarkable collaboration, remarkable contribution while listening the age of Wordsworth, general prose, the age of Wordsworth, the novel writing were also influenced by the French Revolution. It has also almost the same characteristics that we have studied earlier about this romantic age that was totally going against materialism. The age of Tennyson, 1832 to 1887. The age of Tennyson. In Victorian age we study him. The age of Tennyson, what following our corresponds very closely as a period of literature with the Victorian age. In general history, Victoria married the throne in 1837 to her reason began their work. But though her own life extended till 1901, we may conveniently take the year of her jubilee, 1887. Race in literature had arisen, while those of the former generation who still survived had nothing of importance to their production, and indeed